not only doom his presidency, they will do enormous damage to the U.S. economy. Good man, bad president. Over the full span of my career, I have spent a great deal of time directly and indirectly involved with government. My first stint in Washington, D.C. was during the years 1967 and 1968 when I worked at the Brookings Institution, a well-respected liberal think tank. I was appointed the chief economist of the newly formed Office of Management and Budget, OMB, in late 1970 under my mentor and OMB director George P. Shultz. My first official task was traveling to Japan, China, and Vietnam in Air Force Two with both George Shultz and John Ehrlichman, then head of President Nixon's domestic council. Thereafter, I became integrally involved in the domestic economy of Vietnam and U.S. relations with China. After returning to the University of Chicago in 1972, I stayed on as a personal consultant 2 days a week for George Shultz when he was Secretary of the Treasury, and later on with Caspar Weinberger when he was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and William Simon when he was Secretary of the Treasury. After Nixon's resignation and Gerald Ford's ascendance to the presidency, I was a personal consultant to Donald Rumsfeld as Chief of Staff for the President and his deputy Dick Cheney, and later on to Cheney as Chief of Staff and Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense. My role with President Reagan was initially as an economic advisor in his campaigns of 1976 and 1980. In 1980, I was one of a handful of original members of Governor Reagan's Executive Advisory Committee, along with Justin Dart, Holmes Tuttle, William French Smith, Bill Wilson, Earl Jorgensen, Ben Biagini, Jack Rather, Charles Zwick, Alfred Bloomingdale, Judy Israel, Ted Cummins, and others. I was the young kid on the block, if that's even conceivable now. Later on, I was a member of President Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board for his full 8 years in office. Then, during the Clinton years, I was on the Congressional Policy Advisory Board, which consisted of some 25 people who advised the Republican congressional leadership at that time. The reason I dragged the reader through this tedious litany is to give weight to one generalization that, in my opinion, is critical to understanding policymaking in Washington, D.C., or anywhere else, for that matter. Whenever people make hasty decisions when panicked or drunk, the consequences are almost always ugly. I do not believe that there ever needed to be a stimulus program in 2008, or any spending package for that matter, to save the economy. When Secretary Paulson went to Congress with a one-page piece of legislation allocating to him and him alone $700 billion to spend as he chose, without any hearings, without any oversight whatsoever, I knew that our government had lost its senses. My view then and now is that Secretary Paulson's decision was a classic panic decision, and the consequences have been ugly. And nothing has changed. The politicians are still running around grabbing at this straw or that straw, trying to save the economy. You should be scared. When I was the chief economist in the White House Office of Management and Budget in August 1971, Richard Nixon assembled his key economic advisers for a panicked weekend retreat at Camp David. On August 14, 1971, President Nixon brought down from the mountain a series of decisions reflecting radical change in economic policy. The impetus for the Camp David meeting in 1971 was a bad inflation number. I think the number came in 1 month at a 4.6% annualized rate, which was a little blip by the standards of the very early 1970s and well below the uptick in early 1970. The economic proposals brought down from Camp David were President Nixon's solution to the inflation and unemployment problems. In summary, President Nixon devalued the U.S. dollar and took the dollar off the gold standard. He imposed a tax surcharge up to 10% on products imported into the United States. He also proposed something called a Job Development Credit, which was an investment tax credit that applied only to American-made investment goods. And last,